The German army during World War II was seen as one of the most effective combat forces that the world had yet seen. However, as war drags on, the lack of manpower in the state starts to affect the armies, and people are drafted into service that were once considered unfit for the army for one reason or another. In Germany's case, they created the Volkssturm, a militia group to draft citizens in late 1944. However, since the start of Operation Barbarossa, the Germans recruited into their armies local Russians from the occupied territories in some numbers. This force was given a name, and they played a role in the Eastern Theater. In this episode, we will be looking at the so-called Russian Liberation Army. In pretty much any war, men would be recruited into the army from the occupied civilian population to some degree, and with the German occupation of Russian territory, this was no exception. Russian volunteers who enlisted into the German army wore a particular patch, showing that they were of the so-called Liberation Army. However, they were known as Heavies to the other men. This didn't actually mean much at first, outside of a collective term for all Russians within the German army, and almost all of them would engage in non-combat duties, acting as drivers, stretcher bearers, runners, or security forces. It was estimated that around 1/6 of the German 6th Army's strength at Stalingrad was of these Russian Heavies. Hitler was willing to let this liberation army be spread in propaganda so long as no standing unit was actually formed. Due to this, some Red Army soldiers surrendered or defected in hopes of joining an army that did not actually exist. Many that were part of this army were Soviet prisoners of war, who volunteered to serve under German command just to get out of prisoner camps, as they had a greater chance of living on the outside in this war than inside that camp. This wasn't the only organization fulfilling the same purpose though. The Russian Liberation Movement was based along much the same factors. However, it was largely made up of white Russian immigrants and various anti-communist Russian individuals. This army consisted of around 8,000 men under the command of former Red Army General Andrei Vlasiv, a man who defected after being captured during the siege of Leningrad. His men would act as a security force for the occupied regions, which were supposed to be supplied up to the standard of regular army units, but due to the fear of disloyalty, they were always kept under-equipped. Around another half-dozen major German allied Russian units would be formed during the war, again largely acting as security forces, but some of them would even engage on the front lines of combat as well. Vlasiv had been trying to get German high command to allow him to create a large Russian army loyal to Germany to aid in their fight against the Soviets. However, irrespective of his pleas, by mid-1943, several 100,000 ex-Soviets were serving in the German forces, either as Heavies or in Eastern Volunteer units. This latter group was normally acting in a security role of the occupied territory, where they constituted a major part of the German effort to counter the activity of Soviet partisans. The Germans were, however, always concerned about their reliability, and following the German defeats in 1943, the reliability of these groups would instead become a liability, as increased desertions and mutinies started to occur. So to solve this problem, a large section of these eastern units were transferred away from their homeland and sent to the Western Front, where it was assumed that the men would behave better as they were no longer connected to their homes. And while some did prove to be effective units in the Western Front, many others simply surrendered the first chance they had to the Allied powers. The Russian Liberation Army did not officially exist as a combat unit until autumn of 1944, after Heinrich Himmler persuaded a very reluctant Hitler to allow the formation of 10 Russian army divisions. On November the 14th of 1944, Vlasov would go to Prague and read aloud the Prague Manifesto before his men. This document stated the purposes of the battle against Stalin and spelled out 14 points which this army was fighting for, and it was essentially anti-Semitic and anti-Stalin rhetoric. Several armed groups who had been fighting already submitted themselves to this new army, such as the Russian Corps of General Boris Stefan, the Battle Group of White General Torklo, and the Cossacks of Ataman von Panwitz, although the turn of events prevented them from ever being incorporated into the army directly, or even being able to be used by Vlasov. However, other army groups led by such individuals like General Pyotr Krasnov and several Ukrainian groups refused to submit themselves to Vlasov, and they denounced him publicly. These Ukrainian units would eventually create their own national army within Germany, which would be dubbed the Ukrainian National Army. This force was meant to encompass the 220-odd thousand Ukrainians that were within the whole of the German army, but when it was created in March of 1945, only around 50,000 were wrapped into it, and they fractured off and surrendered to various Allied commands across Europe. By February of 1945, only one division, that being the 600th Russian Infantry, was fully organized, under the command of General Sergei Boyanshenko. A second division was incomplete when he was set off to fight, and a third division was formed but only on paper, and it didn't actually have men attached to it. Men of the second division did see action on the front line. They fought against the Soviets at the Oder River on April the 11th of 1945, in an attempt to see how effective these men would be under their own strength. They performed relatively fairly, holding off the Soviets for 3 days before needing to retreat in the face of superior numbers. Vlasov, now in command of this large army, had other plans though. When he gained control over the Liberation Army in February of 1945, he consolidated his men into one group and marched them south, in an effort to concentrate all Russian anti-communist forces that would be loyal to him. As an army, he reasoned, they could all surrender to the Allies on favorable terms, which would mean that there would be no reparation to the Soviet Union, where he knew that both him and his men would face death. Vlasov sent several secret delegates to the Western Allies, hoping that they would sympathize with their goals and potentially use his army in an inevitable future war with the USSR. As if anyone was thinking of attacking the Soviets or anything. During the march south, the 1st Division of the RLA aided the Czech partisans in the Prague uprising against the German occupation, and the uprising started on May the 5th of 1945. Vlasov was initially reluctant to agree to this move, but ultimately did not resist General Boyanshenko's decision to fight against the Germans. His men managed to fend off waves of SS attacks within Prague itself, largely thanks to the heavy weaponry that the division was equipped with, and they managed to keep most of Prague from being destroyed. The Liberation Army needed to move the next day post-liberation though, as the council in Prague was largely loyal to communists, who would have turned the army over to the Soviets as they approached. The army would move south and they would surrender to General Patton of the US Third Army, who was just to the south of Prague. They were unwilling to harbor members of the RLA though, fearing that it would heavily worsen tensions with the USSR. Over 1,000 men from this group were handed over to the Soviets in 1946, with Vlasov and a number of other ranking members of the Liberation Army that were tried and hanged as traitors to the Soviet Union, putting yet another tale of history finally to rest.